Judge Teleke, the courtroom is yours, and we are now on a live stream, folks. Enjoy the trial.
Great, thank you, Glenn. All right, we're going to call the case of Stevie Rogers versus Drew Mars. My name is Judge Nick Teleke. Just a reminder to our scoring judges, check out the buttons on the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. Make sure that your audio and video are off unless Glenn tells us otherwise. And we should also have all of our videos set to hide all non-video participants. So the only people on the screen should be myself and the two advocates. So let's go ahead and get started. Can we hear appearances from the plaintiff first?
Yes, Your Honor. Good afternoon. My name is Shirley Song, along with my co-counsel, Jacqueline Rayfield.
Good afternoon, Your Honor.
Good afternoon.
We'll be representing the plaintiff in today's case, Mr. Stevie Rogers.
Good afternoon, Your Honor.
Good afternoon. Defense?
Yes, Your Honor. Good afternoon. My name is John Ulysses Kevin Lynch, and today I, along with Shant Olmasekian, will be representing the defendant, Drew Mars. And Shant, if you would like to introduce yourself.
Good afternoon, Your Honor.
Good afternoon. All right, before we get started, are there any pre-trial things we need to discuss, housekeeping matters, anything like that?
Yes, Your Honor. We'd like to draw the court's attention to the fact that exhibits 1 through 7 are already pre-admitted, and they may be used for any purpose at any time during trial. Of note, those exhibits include the autopsy report and toxicology screening of Agatha Lee's body, as well as a floor plan and photograph of Lee Manor, as well as the Lee detective's report.
Defense, anything to add?
That's our understanding of the prior evidentiary rulings as well.
Excellent. Okay, so exhibits 1 through 7 are in evidence already, and then the other ones have not been pre-admitted, at least at this point, right?
Right.
Got it.
Additionally, Your Honor, we'd like to ask your preferences on whether or not counsel should remain seated or stand for certain parts of examinations or statements.
No preferences, whatever you folks would like to do.
All right, and the plaintiff also would like to invoke Rule 615, the constructive sequestration of all witnesses barring party representatives. In today's trial, Stevie Rogers is going to be our party representative.
Sure, and defense, I assume you want the defendant staying in trial?
Yes, Drew Mars will be our party representative.
All right, so ordered. Anything else?
And lastly, Your Honor, would you like us to ask permission each time we're going to share screen to display a document or a demonstrative?
No, that won't be necessary. Go ahead and do that as you need. And if there's an objection to displaying it early, we'll hear it at that time.
All right, and with that, we're ready to go.
All right, anything from the defense?
Yes, Your Honor. We just ask that under Midland's Rule of Evidence 603, all witnesses are presumed to be constructively sworn in.
Yes, so ordered.
And with that, Your Honor, the defense is also ready to proceed.
All right, excellent. So then we're going to go to opening statements from each party. Everyone should please make sure that you're in speaker view. That button is on the upper right-hand part of your screen. And attorneys, please make sure to remember to mute yourselves when the other attorney is speaking. So we'll start off with the opening statement from the plaintiff. And just so everyone knows, I'm going to turn off my video during those.
May I proceed, Your Honor?
You may.
The defendant switched the pills to secure the money. Throughout today's case, members of the jury, you're going to hear all about the actions of Drew Mars, the defendant. How Drew poisoned Agatha Lee in order to secure her fortune. But before we get into all of that, I want to remind you what today's trial is really about. We're here to discuss a family that faced unimaginable tragedy. I want you to meet that family. Stevie Rogers and his grandmother, Agatha Lee. Members of the jury, you're going to hear today about an unbreakable bond between these two, forged over the years of Stevie's happy childhood. But you'll also hear that this family was rocked in 2008 by the tragic death of Stevie's mother and Agatha's daughter. After this accident, you'll hear that Stevie was lost and Agatha was inconsolable. but that even after years apart, the two had a connection so strong that it couldn't be broken. And when Stevie returned to Agatha's doorstep in 2018, they were as close as ever. But members of the jury, there was one person who stole away their chance for a happy reunion. The defendant, Drew Mars. Mars was Miss Lee's caretaker from 2008 to 2018, and you'll hear today that Mars and Miss Lee were close. So close that while Stevie was away, Miss Lee made Mars the beneficiary in her will. And today, members of the jury, you'll hear that Mars desperately needed that money. And that brings us to August 14th, the day that Miss Lee died. I want to take you to a conversation that happened that morning between Stevie and his grandmother. You see, Mars was walking to the study when she heard Stevie and Miss Lee discussing Miss Lee's will. Miss Lee told her only grandchild she wanted to change her will, to leave all of her fortune, her legacy, to Stevie. And in that moment, Mars knew that she had to do something, anything, to secure her money. You'll hear that Mars immediately drove to a pharmacy. She bought a medication called chloroandramine, one she knew Miss Lee was deathly allergic to. She switched Miss Lee's normal pills for this deadly dose, and then she snuck into Miss Lee's room that night and poisoned her. Members of the jury, you'll hear that by that night, Miss Lee was dead. And sure enough, Mars inherited her $20 million. Members of the jury, Drew Mars may still get away with a crime today, but don't let her get away with the money too. You see, that's where you come in, members of the jury, because today we're suing Miss Mars on something called the Slayer Law. This law states that if you, members of the jury, find today that Mars in fact killed Miss Lee, then Mars cannot inherit those millions of dollars. And now I want to be very clear about exactly what we have to prove to you today, because today's trial is not a criminal murder trial, it's a civil case. And that means we simply have to prove that Mars acted in a way that she knew or hoped would cause Miss Lee's death. And we only have to prove that today by a preponderance of the evidence, a simple tip of the scales. So if you find by the end of today's trial, it is even slightly more likely than not that Drew Mars killed Mars will not walk away with her stolen millions. And today we are going to prove that to you, members of the jury, by calling two witnesses. First, you're going to hear from Stevie Rogers himself. Stevie's going to tell you about the relationship he had with his grandmother, how they were finally reconnecting after that family tragedy that tore them apart for years. But he'll also tell you that Mars was jealous of their relationship. And he'll tell you that he saw Mars sneak into his grandmother's room on the night of August 14th to switch those pills, the night that his grandmother was killed. Next, you're going to hear from Murphy Bond, the detective on the case. And Detective Bond will show you that Mars had the motive, the means, and the opportunity to kill Miss Lee. And Detective Bond will also tell you that chloroandramine, that drug that Miss Lee had an allergic reaction to, an allergic reaction that killed her, that exact drug was found in Miss Mars's closet. Members of the jury, today you have the chance to grant justice to a grieving grandchild. After so much tragedy, Stevie Rogers can get peace. A peace that comes with knowing that the person who took his grandmother's life will not steal her legacy too. At the end of today's trial, find in favor of the plaintiff. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. Opening for the defense.
Yes, may I proceed, Your Honor?
Please.
Drew Mars had no reason to kill Agatha Lee. Drew Mars had no reason to kill Agatha Lee. Now, members of the jury, you're going to hear a pretty complicated case today. You're going to learn the difference between chloroandramine pills and Winterin pills. You're going to hear different dates, times, testimony from several witnesses. But I want you to focus on one moment that'll make this convoluted jumble of facts very straightforward. It's the conversation on August 14th between the renowned author Agatha Lee and her grandson, Stevie Rogers. It's this conversation where Stevie learns that he won't be getting any of Miss Lee's $20 million estate. See, Stevie Rogers, at the age of 31, had been living off of the $2 million he had inherited from his parents. And after 10 years of traveling the world, his money had just run out. And on August 14th, he learned he won't be able to take any more trips to the sandy beaches of the Caribbean unless he stood on his own 2 feet. That he won't be able to treat his grandmother like a personal ATM. That Drew Mars, Agatha Lee's beloved caretaker of 10 years, would continue to inherit her estate. It's this conversation, Miss Lee's study, that tells us Drew Mars had no reason to murder Agatha Lee. See, as the defendant, we have no burden in today's case. We don't have to call up any witnesses. We don't have to make any statements. That burden rests entirely on the prosecution, on the plaintiff. And the plaintiff was right. This is a civil case. So you must determine by a preponderance of the evidence whether it's more likely than not that Drew Mars murdered Miss Agatha Lee. But we're going to show you that Drew Mars had no reason, no motive to kill Agatha Lee, which makes it more likely that she didn't. And we're going to show you that by calling up 2 witnesses. First, you're going to hear from Drew Mars herself. She's going to tell you that how much she looked up to Miss Lee, how much she saw her as her own grandmother. You're going to hear that they had such a great relationship that Miss Lee changed her will to include Drew Mars. You're going to learn that Miss Lee didn't even want Stevie to inherit the will in the first place because she wanted to give her grandson the opportunity to stand on his own 2 feet, to make his own living, to get a regular job for once in his life. But you don't have to take the defendant's word for it, because next we're going to call up Ryan Cabrera. He's a writer working on producing a biography for Miss Lee. And he's going to confirm that Miss Lee had no intention of putting her grandson back in the will. He's going to explain that Miss Lee and Drew Mars, well, they really did have a loving relationship. So I want you as members of the jury to ask yourself an important question throughout the trial. Why? Why would Drew Mars kill someone she venerated, who she saw as her own grandmother? Why would she kill the one who was so generous with her, provided her a home and a genuine friendship? See, the facts and the witness examinations will prove that there is no reason, that there's no motive as to why Drew Mars would kill Agatha Lee. And that's why my co-counsel, Ulysses Kevin Lynch, well, he's going to come up and ask you to find the defendant not liable. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. All right. So we're going to go ahead and get started with the plaintiff's case in chief, unless there are any other matters from the plaintiff. Before plaintiff calls their first witness, if everyone could please switch to gallery view. That button's in the top right-hand corner of your screen. That way you can see the attorneys and the witnesses at the same time. Is the plaintiff ready to call their first witness?
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, the plaintiff calls Stevie Rogers to the stand.
Mr. Rogers, you can start when you're ready.
Yes, Your Honor. Please introduce yourself to the court.
Hello, my name is Stevie Rogers.
Mr. Rogers, why are we here today?
On August 15th, 2018, I found my grandma dead in her bed. I'm here because I'm suing her former caretaker, Drew Mars.
Can you tell us a little bit about your grandmother?
Of course. My grandmother is Agatha Lee. You probably know her as the mysterious one-hit wonder author of the book Death in a Bottle.
Can you tell us a little bit more about your family?
Yeah. Agatha was my grandma on my mom's side. Growing up, we were all very close, but that changed when my parents passed away.
When did your parents pass away, Mr. Rogers?
July 4th, 2008. Car accident. 11
And
days
how did that
before my 21st birthday.
And how did that impact you?
You know, I was getting ready to graduate college. Not having them there for that or for the start of law school, safe to say it hurt a lot.
Mr. Rogers, what was your relationship with your grandmother like after your parents' passing?
Seeing my grandma just made things hard. It brought up a lot of tough memories. We didn't talk for a really long time after my parents' passing, but I changed that in July of 2018.
Did you communicate before then?
Every now and again. In February, Grandma sent me a letter saying that she was going to be excluding me from her will.
Would you recognize a copy of that will if we showed it to you today?
I would.
And would you recognize a copy of the following will, the new will, if we showed that to you?
Yes.
Your Honor, at this time, my opposing counsel is going to display the wills on the screen. Or pardon, my co-counsel. Now, Mr. Rogers, do these look like those wills as you remember them?
Yes, so the one on the left that says Exhibit 8, that's the will that my grandma issued in 2008. And the one on the right is the will that she issued in 2018.
They look like fair and accurate.
Yes, they do.
Your Honor, at this time, the plaintiff enters Exhibits 8 and 9 into evidence.
Any
No
objections?
objection, Your Honor.
All right. 8 and 9 are received.
Mr. Rogers, can you describe a little bit the change in that will?
It's pretty simple. In the first one, Grandma listed me as the only beneficiary of her estate. But in 2018, she changed that to be Drew Mars.
And how did that change make you feel?
It hurt. We were really close before that, and it hurt me knowing that maybe my behavior hurt her so much that she had to do this. It was something I wanted to fix.
How did you go about fixing it?
By just going to her. I found out that she had moved from Alabama to Midland State, and I went to her house right away.
Your Honor, at this time, my co-counsel is going to display a picture of Lee Manor. That's right, we'll just describe it. Mr. Rogers, can you tell us a little bit about what happened when you arrived at the house?
Sure. I got there on July 4th, 2008. I saw Grandma picking up some leaves outside, and I just ran up to her and I gave her a hug.
And when was it that you arrived?
Again.
When was it that you arrived, Mr. Rogers?
July 4th, 2018.
How did it feel to be back with your grandmother?
Awesome. It felt like we were falling back into our old routine really quickly.
How much time would you spend together when you were back this most recent time?
Basically all day. We'd have meals together, play games, watch movies, all those sorts of things.
And was anyone else living in the house?
Yeah. Grandma's caretaker, Drew Mars.
Now, did you know Drew Mars before you came to visit this most recent time?
Not really. I knew from Grandma's letters that Drew was her caretaker, and that she was written in on Grandma's most recent will.
Did you and Drew spend any time together?
Not when I was there. To be honest, I never felt welcomed by Drew.
What do you mean you never felt welcomed by Drew Mars?
From the moment I got there, I felt very comfortable around Drew. They would either ignore me during conversations or cut me off altogether. It got worse the longer I was there.
What do you mean by that?
I think by the second week I'd gotten back, she was asking me how long I would be there, if I was going to be leaving soon.
I want to move on to talking specifically about August 14th, and I know this might be difficult, so if you need a moment, let me know.
Okay.
Can you tell us how that day, the day that your grandmother's died, began?
I made her favorite breakfast in the morning, and then we just spent the rest of the morning together, chatting, playing cards, and in Grandma's study. Eventually, the conversation shifted to something more serious.
What did the conversation shift to?
We were talking about how nice it was to be with each other and spend time with each other again. And then Grandma brought up the will.
How exactly did she do that?
She told me that she was really happy to have me back and that she planned to call her lawyer soon and have me written back in on the will.
I want to pause for just a second. During this conversation, when your grandmother told you she planned to write you back into the will, was there anyone else in the study?
No, there wasn't.
Was there anyone else who could hear?
I couldn't say for sure, but I know that the way Drew behaved after we came out of the study made me nervous.
Well, how was she behaving?
Right when I walked out of the study, she was just staring at me. I could see her eyes and her face were blood red. I looked down and I saw that her fists were clenched.
Did she say anything to you?
Not exactly. She just looked at me. Her face was shaking and she mouthed, "No way."
Mr. Rogers, I want to move on from when she said no way to later that night.
Okay.
Can you tell us a little bit about what happened then?
Grandma and I had dinner. Spent some time together after that, and at around 9:30, I went to spend some time alone.
And what happened after that?
I went just outside her room in the sitting area to have a drink. And I saw Drew out in the hallway.
What did you see Drew doing?
Drew was tiptoeing into the study. It looked like she had something in her hand. I couldn't tell what. Her face was just held up like this.
Mr. Rogers, what time exactly did you see her tiptoeing into this room?
9:35, 9:40, somewhere around there.
And Mr. Rogers, do you know exactly what time your grandmother died that night?
The autopsy says she died between 9 p.m. and 3 a.m. that night.
And how exactly did she die, Mr. Rogers?
She had a deadly allergy to a heartburn medicine called chlorandramine. The autopsy found it in her blood, and it caused a heart attack.
Mr. Rogers, do you know what Drew Mars was doing when she walked into your grandmother's room at 9:30 that night?
No, I don't. And at the time, I just thought she was going in to give her nightly medicine.
Well, Mr. Rogers, did Drew Mars know about your grandmother's deadly chlorandramine allergy?
Yeah, she was the one who told me.
And who exactly was usually in charge of your grandmother's medication?
Drew Mars.
And do you know who set up your grandmother's medication for that week?
Drew Mars.
Thank you, Your Honor. I have no further questions.
Thank you, counsel. Cross-examination,
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed?
please.
One moment, sorry. Now, good afternoon, Mr. Rogers. I'm just going to be asking you a few questions, and I'll be right out of your hair.
Okay.
Now, Mr. Rogers, you would say that, sorry, Mr. Rogers, I want to talk to you about money. Now, I'd like to start off by discussing your trust fund. You assumed control of a trust fund in 2008 when your parents passed away.
That's right. A couple months after my 21st birthday.
Now, you had about $2 million in this trust fund. Is that right?
That's right. My parents wanted to make sure I would be safe, secure if anything happened to them.
So from that point, you made ends meet from the $2 million that you had inherited. Is that right?
Yeah. When they passed, I was still a student, and then I was entering law school. So I used up a lot of that.
Well, after law school, you would say you've never had a regular job.
That's right. I've tried some book writing, some music work, but no, not a 9 to 5, if that's what you mean.
And you spent this $2 million on trips to Europe and the Caribbean?
Part of it. It paid for law school, my apartment my senior year of college.
And you spent that $2 million, quote, having a good time.
Yes, at some points I would enjoy myself, sure.
And you spent all of that money in about 10 years, is that right? From 2008 to 2018.
As I'm sure you know, counselor, law school is expensive.
And the same year you inherited that trust fund, you were also made the beneficiary of Agatha Lee's entire estate.
Yeah, I mean, not right away. It was a little bit later on in the year. But yeah, you're right.
Meaning in 2008, you were set to inherit all of the money your grandmother had, including the royalties from her book.
If I remember the terms right, that's correct.
And her book had sold over 65 million copies worldwide.
Grandma was world famous. You're right.
And Mr. Rogers, while you were having a good time in Europe and the Caribbean, you knew you were standing to inherit all of Agatha Lee's wealth.
I don't really know what you mean by that. I was doing law school for the first bit of it, and then I did my own thing. But I knew that the will was in place, yeah.
Mr. Rogers, directing you back to my question, while you were having a good time in Europe and the Caribbean, those 10 years between 2008 and 2018, all the while you knew you were set to inherit all of Agatha Lee's wealth. Yes or no?
Yes, I knew about the will.
Now, I'd like to discuss your relationship with Agatha Lee, your grandmother. After you inherited the trust fund and were made the beneficiary of the will, you didn't really see your grandmother that often.
Not after law school. You're right.
That's right. After you left law school in 2011, the next time you saw your grandmother was 2018. Is that right?
That's correct.
So you didn't see her for 7 years.
I was lost. Yeah, it was 7 years.
Now, throughout these 7 years while you were lost, your grandmother wrote you letters.
A few times, yes.
She would call you.
Also a few times, that's right.
And from what you remember, in those 7 years, you only called your grandmother in 2017 to wish her happy birthday.
That's right.
From what you remember, you didn't respond to any of the letters she wrote you.
You're right. I didn't.
Other than 2017, during those 7 years, you didn't respond to her phone calls.
Well, I wasn't responding to a phone call in 2017, but yes, you're right.
But that's all right, because you two were still very close.
Yeah, I know our relationship was strong enough that even while I was off sort of figuring things out, we would remain close.
That's right, Mr. Rogers. While you were out figuring things out, you could go years without speaking and still remain close.
I think every family hopes they can do that.
Now, I want to talk to you about whether or not your grandmother felt the same way. Mr. Rogers, your grandmother told you that she couldn't remember the last time you wrote to her.
Yes.
Sorry, I wasn't able to hear the objection. What was the objection on the ground?
Objection hearsay to the statement of Agatha Lee.
What was the statement?
The statement specifically is, you didn't respond to, sorry, wait. She couldn't remember, sorry, the grandmother told you that she couldn't remember the last time you wrote to her.
So it's Miss Lee saying, I can't remember the last time you wrote to me.
That's correct.
All right, how's that not
Your Honor,
hearsay?
huh?
Yes.
Your Honor, I'm not offering this for the truth of the matter asserted, rather to show effect on the listener. What was Stevie Rogers' actions after receiving that letter, whether or not he contacted her in any way afterwards?
Can you make a, 1 second, yeah. Can you make a proffer as to what that effect is going to be?
Yes, of course. Your Honor, I'm showing that after Agatha Lee wrote this letter detailing the way that Stevie Rogers had failed to maintain a relationship with her, that Stevie Rogers didn't call her right away saying, I'm sorry, I was wrong, I'm coming right over. In fact, he came 5 months later to Alabama after his trust fund money had run almost completely out.
So just to be clear, you're saying that the effect on the listener was what he did not do, right?
Exactly, yes.
Okay, Plaintiff?
Response. Your Honor, this opposing counsel has already elicited statements about communications between Stevie Rogers and his grandmother during those years. That is, whether he did or didn't call her. This statement is not necessary in order to show those reactions, as they've already been elicited. So entering the specific words of Agatha Lee still has truth value and is not providing any further action in this case or effect on Stevie Rogers. Furthermore, I believe opposing counsel mentioned a letter, and I would just like to reserve the right to re-raise my objection if we get into a letter at a later point.
I'll definitely let you reserve the right to re-raise that objection. Defense counsel, how is the specific words of Miss Lee relevant if all we care about is the effect on this witness?
Your Honor, the words are, first of all, I'm more than happy to put a limiting instruction stating that whatever words that we're about to elicit from this testimony is going to be offered, not for the truth of the matter asserted. I'm very happy with the limiting instruction on that. As far as the response to that question, during the direct examination, if I may make an offer of proof.
Please.
So during the direct examination, Mr. Rogers mentioned a specific line saying, after he had received that letter in February of 2018, it hurt me that she felt that way. Stating that, and then showing that after receiving that letter, after receiving those responses, 5 months later, that's when he decides to show up on his grandmother's doorstep. That's going to the effect on the listener, specifically showing the verbiage of his grandmother and the direct actions of Stevie Rogers following, or the inactions.
I see. I guess I'm a little bit confused. I'll give you one more shot at it about how the specific words that Miss Lee used are relevant to what his reaction would be if that's all we're offering it for. So a limiting instruction won't do us much good if we don't need the words in the first place. So how are the words that she used affecting him differently from just saying he got the letter and then it took him 5 months to do anything about it?
The words specifically show the fact that the relationship, Agatha Lee felt that the relationship between herself and Mr. Rogers had deteriorated. Prior to that, the testimony elicited during those 7 years was that he wouldn't respond to her phone calls. At this point, we didn't know how Miss Lee felt about that. And this letter shows us that that this is how she felt. And although we're not offering for the truth of the matter asserted, it shows that in response to how she felt about him, what he did in response to that.
Okay. It sounds a little bit like we're offering this just to try to get at what Miss Lee thought about that, which starts to sound like we're using it for its truth value. So I'm going to sustain the objection and strike that statement from the record.
That's fine. I will move on. Sorry. Okay. So, and so in that letter that you received in February 2018, Mr. Rogers, would you recognize a copy of that letter if I was to present it to you?
Yes, I would.
Your Honor, at this time, I ask that my co-counsel put up exhibit number 10, which is a letter that Miss Agatha Lee wrote to Stevie Rogers.
Court.
Now, is this, Mr. Rogers, is this the letter that we were discussing earlier?
Yeah, it looks like it. I can't see the bottom, but the rest of it looks like it.
It's a fair and accurate copy, to your knowledge.
I think so.
And it's complete?
If the bottom is signed by Grandma, then yeah.
Your Honor, at this time, we admit Exhibit 10 into evidence.
I'd object to hearsay, Your Honor. Under the same grounds as before, opposing counsel stated they were using this to show the feelings of Agatha Lee. That is being offered for the truth, and so it is hearsay.
Your Honor, this primarily goes on the effect on the listener. Again, it caused Stevie Rogers to eventually come home after receiving this letter, and that it details that he is going to be removed from the will. So because it caused him to believe that he was going to be removed from the will, that's what caused him to go over to Agatha Lee's house and persuade her to put him in the will. So
I understand. So in this letter, let's see, where is this? So you're specifically, it looks like, focusing on the 4th paragraph of this letter?
That's correct, yes.
Response,
Okay.
Your Honor.
Please.
Your Honor, if that is the case, I would ask that the entire rest of the letter be constructively redacted, or that they simply ask Stevie Rogers specifically to say whether he knew his grandmother was going to remove him from the will. The entire rest of this letter is not necessary to elicit that reaction, and is still being offered for the truth and is hearsay.
Yeah, are there any other parts of this letter, defense counsel, that you want to keep in that go to that effect on the listener, or are you okay with redacting everything?
I'm happy with redacting everything but the 4th paragraph.
Okay, and that's okay with plaintiff?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, and we'll keep in the Stevie and the love Nana Agatha, because otherwise this doesn't tell us a whole lot. The rest of the letter is constructively redacted except for that 4th paragraph.
So, Mr. Rogers, I'd like to ask you a little bit about this letter. Now, in the first line, it says, because we've become family in name only, I've decided to change my will. Is that correct?
Yes, that's what I was talking about before when I say that. Sort of how I made her feel hurt me.
And following that sentence, it discusses how Drew has been good to her for over a decade and had turned down several offers that would have paid Drew far more money than Miss Lee does. Is that correct?
Yeah, I don't know what those offers were, but that's what the letter says.
And finally, it states that as soon as she signs this letter, she's going to sign a new will, leaving everything to Drew.
Yes.
Now, I'd like to move on to August 14th. Your grandmother spoke to you about her will, didn't she?
I'm sorry, could you say the first part again?
I'd like to speak about the morning of August 14th. On that morning, your grandmother spoke to you about her will. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
And the next day, Mr. Rogers, she died from a fatal dose of chloroandramine.
Yeah.
Objection, Your Honor, under 403.
Okay, can you explain?
Your Honor, for the opposing counsel to say that they had a conversation and then right after Agatha Lee died is substantially more prejudicial than probative. By linking these two items in their question, they may unfairly bias the jury without providing any probative value.
It's the date's counsel. You can redirect on it if you're worried about it. Overruled.
Yes, Your Honor.
Let me just repeat my question. The next day, after you had that conversation about her will, your grandmother died from a fatal dose of chloroandramine.
I found her body the next morning. You're right.
Redirecting you back to my question, she died from a fatal dose of chloroandramine. Yes or no?
Yes.
Now, prior to her death, Mr. Rogers, you knew where to find chloroandramine, didn't you?
Drew had spoken to me about the allergy and about the pills before. If that's what you mean, yes.
Yes or no, Mr. Rogers, you knew where to find chloroandramine, didn't you?
From Drew, yes.
You also knew where to find your grandmother's medication.
Yeah, I think Drew, organized it in her room.
You think, let me redirect you back to my question, you knew where to find your grandmother's medication, yes or no?
Yes.
And you knew where your grandmother kept her pills, yes or no?
I knew that Drew put the pills in the pill organizer.
Mr. Rogers, you knew when those pills were refilled every week. Is that right?
I think Drew did it on Saturday, you're right.
Yes or no, you knew when those pills were refilled.
Yes, I knew when Drew refilled them.
And you knew what time she took those pills. Is that right?
Yeah, she took them around the same time every night.
And you knew that your grandma had a fatal allergy to chloroandramine.
Drew told me.
And when you found your grandmother on August 15th, you called 911 right away. Is that right?
She was fine the day before, and then I found her dead. I couldn't make sense of it. I felt in my bones that something was wrong.
That wasn't quite my question, Mr. Rogers. I asked you when you found your grandmother on August 15th, you called 911 right away. Is that right?
Of course.
And the very first thing you said, yes or no, Mr. Rogers, my grandmother has been murdered.
That's what I said.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Great, thank you. Any redirect?
No redirect, Your Honor. I just ask that Mr. Rogers be allowed to step down.
Absolutely. Thanks for coming in and testifying, Mr. Rogers. All right, plaintiffs, call your next witness.
Yes, Your Honor. The plaintiff calls Murphy Bond.
Hello, Mr.
May I
Bond.
proceed?
Yes, please do.
Please introduce yourself to the jury.
Certainly. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Murphy Bond.
Mr. Bond, what do you do for a living?
Well, I'm a private investigator. I'm licensed in the state of Maryland in private investigation. And for over 30 years, I've been assisting clients in various forms of investigation as a consulting detective.
And how are you involved in today's case?
Well, I was hired following the death of Agatha Lee to investigate a suspicion of foul play. One of the important things in investigation is the rule of perspective. In short, more perspectives is better. So to that end, I assisted the Midlands Police Department in their investigation.
And when did you first become involved?
I first received a call about this case on August 15th, shortly after Miss Lee was found dead.
Now, how did you start your investigation?
Well, I started with conducting interviews of those present at the house that day. There were two people that day. That would be Stevie Rogers, who I determined was Miss Lee's grandson, and Drew Mars, who was Miss Lee's live-in caretaker.
Now, before we get any further, Mr. Bond, I want to establish, did Miss Lee die of natural causes?
Unfortunately, no. The autopsy revealed that Miss Lee had a fatal allergy to a drug known as chloroandramine, and that she had taken that drug and suffered a fatal allergic reaction sometime on the night of August 14th into the morning of August 15th.
Well, did you find any evidence as to how she might have ingested those chloroandramine pills?
Well, there was one other important detail in that autopsy, that Miss Lee had not taken her Winterin pills, which was an arthritis medication. Now, analysis of the two pills revealed that chloroandramine pills happened to look identical to Winterin pills, which indicates the possibility that the drugs were switched.
Well, could such a switch have been accidental?
Well, I can't say that it is impossible. However, given the fact that it must have involved Agatha taking those pills, it is doubtful that she would have known that she was taking chloroandramine, given that she was aware of her own allergy.
Now, if Miss Lee didn't die of natural causes or on an accident, how did you investigate this death?
Well, with this in mind, I investigated the death as a possible foul play. So to that end, I investigated based on the classic triad of such investigations: means, motive, and opportunity for all those involved. I started with opportunity. In other words, attempting to narrow down the people who could have possibly been in a position to cause Miss Lee's death.
Well, how did you narrow down who had the opportunity to kill Miss Lee?
Well, in interviewing Miss Mars and Miss Mars and Mr. Rogers, I determined that they were the only two people who were present in the house around the time that Agatha Lee died.
And Mr. Bond, you also mentioned means and motive. Which one did you look into next?
I proceeded with motive next.
Well, did you find any evidence of a potential motive for either Stevie Rogers or Drew Mars?
Well, there was one detail that did stick out to me. Both, as I understand it, both were at some point in the past involved with Miss Lee's inheritance.
Now, would you recognize Miss Lee's wills where she discusses that inheritance if I were to display them for you?
I would, yes.
Ms. Rayfield, if you could please display exhibits 8 and 9, which are already in evidence. Mr. Bond, do you see those wills up on the screen?
I do, yes.
Now, are they the same as you last saw them?
Yes. On the left here is the 2008 version of that will, and on the right is the later 2018 version.
Now, how do these two versions differ?
Well, in the 2008 will, the entire estate is left to Miss Lee's grandson, Mr. Rogers. However, in 2018, there was a significant change in the terms of that will. Instead of Mr. Rogers receiving the entire inheritance was going to Drew Mars.
Now, during your investigation, did the defendant ever communicate that she knew about this latest will?
They communicated the opposite to me, in fact. During the reading of this will, they simply repeated, "I cannot believe this. I had no idea."
Well, did you find any evidence that contradicted the defendant's claim they had no idea about this latest will?
I did, yes. In the course of my investigation, I found an email written by the defendant that went directly against this notion.
Would you recognize that email if we were to display it?
I would, yes.
Ms. Rayfield, if you could show, thank you, Exhibit 13 is now on the screen. Mr. Bond, do you recognize what this email says?
Yes, this is a picture of the email that I found on Drew Mars's computer. To clarify, I was the one who took this picture.
And is it the same as you last saw it?
It is, yes.
The plaintiff offers Exhibit 13 into evidence.
Any objection?
Yes, Your Honor. Objection to hearsay, not to the statements of Drew Mars, but to the statements of Agatha Lee and the will.
So, sorry, that first sentence in the email is what you're objecting to.
Yeah, both the first sentence includes the words of Agatha Lee. The second sentence includes the words of the will.
Got it. Okay. Response?
Yes, Your Honor. Now, the statements of Agatha Lee that Agatha just told me she changed her will to leave everything to me, we're not offering that for the truth of the matter asserted, that actually happened, because it's in evidence, Exhibit 9, that did happen. And so instead, we're using it here in context to show the effect on the listener, which is this entire email. It's titled OMFG. It's the effect on Drew Mars, the defendant.
That's right. In the second email, or the second sentence, the defense is worried about same thing because that will is already in evidence, right?
I'm sorry, Your Honor. Are you addressing me right now?
Oh yeah, sorry. That's that second or that third sentence that says Agatha showed me a will that's dated today saying XYZ. That will is Exhibit 9, right?
Yes, Your Honor. Every hearsay statement that Agatha is saying has already been entered via Exhibit 9.
Okay. I'm going to overrule the objection and let Exhibit 13 into evidence.
So, Mr. Bond, what does this email say?
Well, in short, it says exactly what they didn't say to me. That they knew that they were the sole inheritor of this estate, and that in the event of Agatha Lee's death, they would receive the inheritance and become a multimillionaire.
Thank you, Ms. Rayfield. You can take that off the screen. Now, Mr. Bond, I want to move on to talk about means.
Certainly.
In your investigation, did you come across anyone who mentioned the drug chloroandramine?
Yes, in discussing Miss Lee's care with Drew Mars, they mentioned that they were aware that Miss Lee was dangerously allergic to chloroandramine, deathly so, in fact.
And to the best of your knowledge, who had access to Miss Lee's medications?
Well, in talking with Drew Mars, I learned that it was their responsibility to restock Agatha Lee's pill box each week.
And do you know if that was the same pill box that Agatha Lee would take those pills from?
Yes, she would take from those nightly.
And did you find any chloroandramine around the house?
We did, yes. During a search of the house, we found a pill bottle full of chloroandramine inside the defendant's closet.
And how was that packaged in the closet? Where was it?
It was in the closet, contained within a black fabric bag.
And did you run that bag for fingerprint evidence?
Yes. On the zipper of the bag, we found a 16-point match of the defendant's fingerprints.
Anyone else's fingerprints?
None. No.
So bringing this all together, Mr. Bond, the means, motive, and opportunity you mentioned, what did they point to in this death of Agatha Lee?
Well, in short, it pointed to Drew Mars. They had the means being aware of this chloroandramine.
Objection, Your Honor. Relevance and ultimate issue, if I might be heard.
Please.
Because what counsel is asking this witness to do is essentially the jury's duty, well, this witness's own opinions on that matter, they aren't relevant. His job is only to provide the facts, which will help the jury come to their own conclusion. His own opinions aren't relevant for today's trial.
Okay, so your objection is under 401, 402, right?
Could you say that again, Your Honor?
Sorry, your objection is under rules 401 and 402, correct?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, plaintiff?
Yes, Your Honor. In that case, 401, 402 deals with relevance, and this certainly makes it more likely that Drew Mars, the defendant, killed Agatha Lee. That's what we're here today to discuss. Now, Mr. Bond right now is summarizing facts he's already told us as we walked through means, motive, and opportunity in this direct examination. Summarizing each of those three categories, he's not opining on something of an ultimate issue.
Yeah, and yeah, I agree. Under 401, 402, I think this is okay. So I'm going to overrule the objection, let him go. And defense, you're free to cross-examine him on this if you want.
Mr. Bond, could you finish describing via means, motive, and opportunity what those pointed to in Agatha Lee's death?
Right. As I was saying, Drew Mars had the access to the means and that they were aware of Agatha Lee's chlorandramine allergy, the opportunity in that they were at the house around that time, and motive in the form of this inheritance.
Now, Mr. Bond, I want to go back to that morning of August 15th, just shortly after everyone discovered that Miss Lee had passed. What was going to happen to her body?
Well, the body was to be sent to the funeral home, but Mr. Rogers objected and said that, and requested an autopsy and a tox screen.
Mr. Bond, can you conduct an autopsy or a tox screen on a body that's been cremated?
Well, I certainly can't examine anybody. I'm not a medical examiner. I won't oversell my qualifications. But as I understand it, generally a medical examiner does require a body to examine when they're examining a body.
Well, what did the defendant want to do with Agatha Lee's body?
They called for the body to be cremated.
Thank you, Mr. Bond. No further questions.
Thank you, counsel. Cross-examination.
May I proceed, Your Honor?
Please.
Before I begin, Mr. Bond, I would just like to make it clear that my internet, unfortunately, is a little bit slow. So if at any point I accidentally cut you off, just let me know and I'll let you finish your answer. With that in mind, though, I'd appreciate a yes or a no where possible.
Of course. And I'm assuming that if there's an answer that requires something beyond a yes or no, you want me to give a meaningful answer there?
Keep it as much to a yes or no as possible, please.
Understood.
And I'd like to pick up with something that you said just a minute ago. You were talking about some fingerprints that you found, right?
That's right.
Now, you'd agree with me that fingerprints aren't timestamps, correct?
No, they're not.
They don't tell you when exactly an object was touched. Isn't that right?
Not necessarily, no.
And they don't tell you what the person who was touching that item was doing when they touched it, right?
Well, not necessarily. In some cases, if there are multiple fingerprints, there can be inferences drawn, for instance, on how the object was held. But but a single fingerprint generally will not convey intent, no.
So that was a no, sir?
In general, no.
So you don't know with certainty whether or not Ms. Mars touched those pills after accidentally dropping a few the week before.
Which pills are you referring to?
The pills in the Winterin bottle.
Yes. That is possible, yes.
You don't know with certainty whether or not Ms. Mars touched that black bag while digging through her closet.
That's right. That's right.
So was that a yes, sir? You don't know it with certainty?
That's correct.
I'd like to talk for a moment about where you found that black bag.
Certainly.
Mr. Olmasekian, can you pull up Exhibit 14 for us? Is that visible to everyone? Mr. Olmasekian, can you zoom out a little bit so we can see the entirety of that photo? Perfect. Now, this looks like a fair and accurate representation of Drew Mars' closet as you found it on the 21st, right?
Yes, that is correct.
And that black bag, that's where that's the black bag which you were talking about having the chlorandramine pills in it and having Drew Mars' fingerprint on it, correct?
Exactly.
Sorry, my internet cut out. Was that a yes, sir?
It was, yes.
All right, motion to admit Exhibit 14 into evidence at this time.
Any objection?
No objection.
All right, so entered as Exhibit 14.
Now, that black bag in that photo, it's rather conspicuously placed, don't you think?
I suppose it's fairly obvious to the naked eye, yes.
It's visible as soon as you open the door. Yeah?
Right, it's on top of what appears to be a pile of sheets there.
You didn't search Lee Manor until August 21st, correct?
That's correct. That's when the Midlands Police Department got a warrant to search.
Well, that was an entire week after Miss Lee was murdered, isn't that correct?
That's correct.
That black bag in that entire week, it wasn't thrown away?
Apparently not, no.
Well, that black bag, it was never moved to another room?
Not in a way that we know of.
It was never even put underneath that pile of blankets where it could be hidden from view. Isn't that right, sir?
Well, if it was on top of the blankets when we ultimately searched it.
So that was a yes, sir. It wasn't even put underneath that pile of blankets where it could have been hidden from view.
Well, given that we searched it on the 21st, we can't be sure if it was placed under the blankets and then placed back on top.
So, sir, when you found it, it had not been placed underneath those blankets where it would be hidden from view. Isn't that right, sir?
That's correct.
In fact, sir, in your own words, you'd say this whole setup, to your detective instincts, it just sounds a little bit too tidy. Right, sir?
Objection to hearsay to Mr. Bond's previous statements. Opposing counsel can just ask him whether or not he agrees with a certain sentiment rather than dredge up his past statements.
What was the specific statement you were trying to elicit?
I'm sorry, Your Honor, I didn't quite catch that.
What was the specific statement of Mr. Bond that you were trying to elicit?
Well, the question, I don't believe any statement was elicited. The question was, in your own words, based off of your experience as a detective, or your instincts as a detective, this whole setup seems a bit just too tidy.
Oh, overruled.
Could you repeat that, Your Honor?
Overruled, you can continue.
Thank you, Your Honor. So, sir, in your own words, this whole setup, it just looks a little bit too tidy to you. That's how you'd put it, right, sir?
It is a relatively neat case. I have certainly dealt with more complicated cases in the past.
Well, that wasn't quite my question. I was asking you if in your own words, you'd say it just sounds a little bit too tidy, this whole setup. And you would say that, wouldn't you, sir?
At first glance, yes.
Because, sir, based on your investigation, Stevie Rogers also knew about Ms. Lee's chlorantramine pills and allergy, right?
That is correct.
Stevie Rogers also had access to Miss Lee's pill organizer.
That is correct. However, again, it was Drew Mars's responsibility to refill that.
So was that a yes?
Yes.
And you never saw who left that black bag in Drew Mars' closet, did you, sir?
No, we have the fingerprints to go on for that.
Sir, I wasn't asking you about the fingerprints. I was asking what you saw. And you never saw who put that black bag in that closet. Isn't that right, sir? Mr. Olmosekian, you can take that down. Now, Mr. Bond, you'd say that your only loyalty is to the truth, right?
That's correct.
And in pursuit of the truth, you want to be as thorough as possible, correct?
Indeed.
Let's talk about what you didn't do as part of your investigation.
Certainly.
You never asked your client what he was doing the night his grandmother died.
I did not know.
I'm sorry, what was that, sir?
I did not. My conversation was focused on, when I talked with Mr. Rogers, we discussed specifically Agatha Lee's inheritance.
So was that a yes question? Was that a yes to my question? You never asked your client what he was doing the night his grandmother died?
We did not specifically discuss that, no.
Something else I'd like to ask you about. Your client told you about a conversation he had with his grandmother, right?
That's correct.
In which she said she would make your client her sole heir?
That's correct.
You never spoke with a witness named Ryan Cabrera about what might have happened in that conversation, did you, sir?
No. Early on in the investigation, the Midlands Police Department ruled that Cabrera was not a person of interest in this investigation, and I agree with that assessment.
That wasn't quite my question, sir. I was asking whether or not you spoke with someone by the name of Ryan Cabrera about that conversation.
Right, I did not.
I want to make it clear to the members of the jury why you're here. You're not a police officer.
I'm not, no. Private investigator.
As a private investigator, you get paid by Mr. Rogers.
That's correct.
He promised you $25,000 for your work in this case.
That's correct.
Thank you. I've got no further questions.
Thank you, counsel. Redirect examination.
No redirect, Your Honor. I ask that Mr. Bond can leave.
All right, great. Thank you, Mr. Bond, for coming in to testify. Is
Of course.
there anything further from the plaintiff?
Yes, Your Honor. Before we close our case in chief, we'd just like to read a stipulation onto the record.
Sure.
That would be stipulation number 24. It says that at the time of Lee's death, she had no debts and $19,838,235 in cash. Lee also owned Lee Manor free and clear with an estimated value of $2.1 million. Estimated future royalties for Death in a Bottle are approximately $3 million. And with that, the plaintiff rests our case in chief and requests a brief recess.
Okay. Anything from the defense?
No, Your Honor. We're happy with a brief recess.
All right, great. So we'll go ahead and take a 5-minute break. Judges and everyone, please remember we're being publicly broadcast still on YouTube, so be careful. And I'll see everybody in about 5 minutes.
Nick, do we want to bring people back?
All the judges ready to go? All right, let's do it.
Okay, I will bring the students back.
All right, is everybody back and ready to go? Okay, any other things from the plaintiff or defense before the defense opens their case in chief? All right, defense, call your first witness.
Yes, Your Honor. Defense calls Drew Morris to the stand.
Well, Ms. Mars?
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Ms. Mars.
Good afternoon.
Could you please do us a favor and introduce yourself to the court?
Of course. Hello, everybody. My name is Drew Mars.
And what do you do for a living?
I used to work as a caretaker for the late Agatha Lee. Now I work as a part-time at-home nurse helping out around Ryder County.
Now, I want to take a second and ask you how you met Agatha Lee. Tell us about how you started working for her.
Actually, I answered a job ad in 2008 to help out as an assistant caretaker for Agatha. I was helping out with cooking, cleaning, driving, medical assistance. And it turned out to a full-time position, and it ended up being one of the best jobs I have ever had. I was her at-home nurse and her friend for a little over 10 years.
And how would you describe your relationship with Miss Lee?
She was like a grandmother. She was a role model. She was a strong, intellectual, independent woman, and she really inspired me to work on myself and grow to be a better person.
Now, I've got to ask, Miss Mars, were you getting paid for your services?
I was, very generously. By the time she passed away, I was getting paid around $80,000 a year. Plus, I was living with her, so I never had to pay for any rent. She was extremely generous.
And did you both ever talk about money, whether it be to get a raise or anything else?
No, money never really came up in the conversation. I got a raise each year without fail. The only other time we actually discussed it was when it was surrounding her will.
Her will. Could you please explain the circumstances?
In February of 2018, she showed me her will and who she would be leaving the estate to. She also showed me the original one, but the new one she showed me would leave everything to me.
And just to be clear, the original one, when was that written?
It was written in 2018.
And then
the original one was written in 2008. The updated version was written in 2018. Excuse me.
Would you recognize a copy of the will from 2018?
I would.
Your Honor, at this time, I ask that my co-counsel, Mr. Kevin Lynch, pull up a copy of Exhibit 9, and it's already entered into evidence. Just give us a second. Just a moment.
No rush.
Yeah. I'll just I'll pull it. Exhibit 9. So I'm pulling up Exhibit 9, which is the will from 2018. This is the will from 2018 we were discussing earlier. Is that right, Ms. Mars?
Yes, it appears to be so.
Now, could you please explain on Exhibit 9 where you understood that her entire estate would be left to you.
It was from the line down near the bottom. I leave my entire estate to my devoted and beloved caretaker, Drew Mars. So long as Drew Mars survives me, I specifically intend to exclude my grandchild, Steve Rogers, from receiving any benefit from my estate or under this will.
And could you tell us, please, what day that will was signed?
The day it was signed?
Yes.
I'm sorry, I don't see the date on here right now. I don't remember what specifically the day.
It's right there underneath the benefit from my estate or under this will, directly underneath.
Yes, the first day of February.
Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing this. Now, I'd like to talk to you about Agatha Lee's relationship with the aforementioned Stevie Rogers. Had Agatha spoken to you about him?
Yeah, she talked about Stevie all the time. He was the only family member that Agatha had left. She always loved Stevie. But it'd been a long time since they had spoken to each other.
When was that?
After Agatha's daughter died, Veronica, Stevie's mom, in 2008, Stevie just stopped coming around to Lee Mansion. Agatha would try to reach out any way she could. I mean, she would write, leave voicemails. She'd even try to email him, although she could never remember her Gmail password. It went on for that for like a good 10 years.
Did Agatha ever tell you about how she felt about the lack of contact?
I mean, she was sad. She felt like, along with her daughter, she left.
Speculation.
Sure. What was the question?
I said, did Agatha ever tell you about how she felt about the lack of contact between herself and Stevie Rogers?
Okay. What was the objection to?
Your Honor, this witness stated that Agatha was sad. This is speculating to the state of mind of Agatha Lee.
Defense.
That's right. Speculation goes to entering the witness's state of mind. Your Honor, at this time, I asked Drew Mars whether or not she had heard or whether Agatha Lee had told her how she had felt. And that's not entering into the witness's state of mind. It's based on the witness's rationally based perceptions.
I see. Okay. So in 1 second, let me just clarify. So we're saying that Drew Mars testified that Agatha Lee told her that Agatha Lee was sad. Is that right?
I don't believe Ms. Mars was able to finish the answer to her question before the objection was raised in the first place. But if allowed to, I believe that's what she would testify.
Okay. Let's go ahead and try it that way. And then if there's an objection to that statement, then we'll take it in turn.
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay. So just to re-raise the question, Ms. Mars, what did Agatha tell you about what did Agatha tell you how she felt about the lack of contact between Stevie Rogers and herself?
I mean, she told me she was sad. It got to the point.
Objection, hearsay.
There it is. Okay.
May I respond, Your Honor? Your Honor, once again, this is not being offered for the truth of the matter asserted, that she was sad, rather the effect on the listener. The fact that she was sad about the lack of contact caused her to draft a new will, including Drew Mars into it and leaving out Stevie Rogers.
Your Honor, point of clarification, who is the listener in this scenario that this had an effect on?
The listener was Miss Agatha Lee.
So Agatha Lee made the statement and is also the listener to her statement.
That's correct. Yes.
Yeah, I'm going to sustain that objection.
Motion to strike, Your Honor.
Yeah, we'll strike just that line that Agatha Lee that she said she was sad.
So after Agatha Lee wrote this letter, did you hear back from Stevie Rogers?
Well, the only
Objection, Your Honor.
time.
Lack of foundation.
Sorry, the objection is to lack of foundation.
Yes. As to the letter, since I believe we struck the previous statement?
Your Honor, the letter has been admitted into evidence.
This is Exhibit 10, right? The letter.
That's correct. The letter written in February 2018. It's been admitted.
The one paragraph. Pardon.
Right. Just as long as we're just focused on paragraph 4, that was the only part that's been admitted.
That's right. But the letter has been admitted. All the other parts have been redacted. But I asked her after you wrote this letter, did Agatha hear back from Stevie? That was
Got it. That's fine. Overruled.
So I'm going to ask that question one more time. After you wrote this letter, did Agatha hear back from Stevie Rogers?
After writing the last letter I saw to Stevie, she did eventually hear back. It was a while later. I think it was 5 months later.
And what exactly did she hear back? How did she get in contact with Stevie Rogers?
Stevie just showed up at the house one day. There was no phone call or no letter to precede him.
Do you know if Stevie Rogers, after arriving at the residence, ever discussed money with his grandmother during his stay after July 2018?
Yeah, I actually overheard Stevie asking Agatha to put him back in the will in Agatha's study on August 14th.
And did Stevie tell you anything after the conversation about that will?
As soon as he walked.
Sorry, excuse me. Right before we get to that, Miss Mars, did Agatha say anything in response?
I heard her say that she wouldn't change it, that he needs to learn how to stand on his own 2 feet.
Objection, hearsay.
Your Honor, this goes to the state of mind of Miss Agatha Lee.
These are statements by Agatha Lee, just to make sure I got this right.
Yes, it was in response to Stevie asking her whether or not she would change his will. She responded, "I won't change it. I need you to stand on her own 2 feet. She loves her too much. So she loves him too much to feed his laziness and indirection." Those are a state of mind. That goes to state of mind.
Okay, so you're not offering it for its truth value, but to show the state of mind of Agatha Lee at the time, not necessarily that she was going to change it or something like that.
That's correct.
Plaintiff's counsel?
Your Honor, these statements are necessarily being entered for the truth. In fact, we have it on a good faith basis that opposing counsel is going to use this statement, among others, to show that Agatha was in fact changing her will, and that Mars believed that to be the case. So these statements can't be entered just for a feeling of Agatha Lee's. They have inherent truth value and shouldn't be allowed to be shown to the jury.
Well, she did in fact change her will, didn't she? And we already have both wills in evidence, right?
Your Honor, she died that day.
Oh, sorry. These are the statements of the day that she died before she could change it, I guess, a third time.
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, on these grounds, I'm going to have to sustain the objection.
Your Honor, if I may move the response over to, then I would move it over to effect of the listener on Stevie as a response to hearsay objections. After hearing these statements, the response that Stevie would have is our contention that he decided that day that he would poison his grandmother and kill her with chlorandramine.
Okay, on that ground, I'll overrule the objection and let it in only for the effect on the listener, not necessarily that she was going to change her will, but that's what she said and that's what Stevie Rogers heard.
Now, did Stevie tell you anything after the conversation about the will?
Well, right after the conversation about Agatha not changing the will, Stevie just walked out of the study. He glared at me and said, I shouldn't count my millions just yet.
And how many days later did Agatha Lee die?
The next morning, the morning of August 15th, I went in to wake her up and I found that she had passed away in her sleep.
And now, Ms. Mars, I'd like to talk a little bit about that day of August 14th. I understand this may be hard for you, but can you tell me what happened after the conversation you overheard in the study?
When Agatha walked out, she asked me to give her a ride down to a steakhouse to have her lunch with Cabrera.
And when you dropped her off at the steakhouse, what did you do next?
I just went to pick up some stuff. I filled up the gas tank. I picked up some stuff from the drugstore, and then I just waited for Agatha to call me to pick her up.
Do you normally make these trips whenever you take Agatha out to lunch?
Sometimes when we need to pick something up around the house, I'm out with the car anyway, so I just grab it on the way back.
Now, can you tell us the last time you saw Agatha Lee alive?
It was on 6 p.m. on August 14th. I brought up dinner to her study.
Now, you've heard opposing counsel come up during their opening statements and discuss chloroandramine pills and Winterin pills. Just to be clear for the jury, have you ever purchased chloroandramine pills?
Not while I was working for Agatha. Never. Not in the entire 10 years I worked there.
And opposing counsel also mentioned a black bag that was found in your closet. Was that your black bag?
No, that was Agatha's. She stored some things in my closet. I did my best not to touch them.
And just to be absolutely clear, did you murder Agatha Lee?
No. I would never dream of hurting Agatha. She was one of my closest friends. I lived with her for 10 years. She was family.
Thank you, Your Honor. I have no further questions at this time.
Thank you, counsel. Cross-examination?
Cross-examine, Your Honor. Do you mind if I stand up?
Sure.
Now, Ms. Mars, I just want to start by talking to you about that will today that you mentioned on direct examination. You said you knew that after that 2018 will, you would be the beneficiary. Isn't that right?
Yes, Agatha told me so in February.
And actually, after you found that out, you sent an email that we saw earlier. And in that email, you said that money would totally change your life. Is that right?
Yeah, it would.
And that would change your life because your family never had very much money. Isn't that right?
No, we didn't grow up with much. I have a large family and we all share pretty much a two-room house.
And in fact, you had a very sick sibling at that time. Isn't that right?
Yeah, my little sister, she was diagnosed with a brain tumor that was inoperational.
And you thought that getting this money could help you to help your sibling.
It would certainly help to make her last months more comfortable, yeah.
But you were actually worried that your sister would die before you ever got the money to help her.
I mean, I was sending money back every month, but I knew she didn't have much longer to live.
Mr. Mars, I just want to pull you back to my question. You've said before that you were worried your sister would die before Agatha Lee, before you could get the money. Is that right?
It's not exactly correct, no. I mean, Agatha was pretty healthy. I knew my sibling would die before her.
Ms. Mars, do you remember being deposed before today?
I do, yeah.
And is it your testimony today that you were not worried Agatha Lee would die after your sister?
I wouldn't say I was worried about it. No, I knew that was the case.
Now, Ms. Mars, if, my co-counsel, if you could pull up the deposition. Ms. Mars, if you could just read along silently while I read aloud. You say on line 146, Agatha was in good health. I knew my sibling might die before Agatha passed away and I wouldn't be able to help. Did I read that correctly?
Yeah, I wouldn't be able to hire an at-home nurse to care for her.
All right, now I want to move on. So, Ms. Mars, you knew that your sibling could die very soon. That's right?
Yeah, when she was originally diagnosed, they gave her 6 months to live. She's already passed.
And now I want to talk a little bit about what happened when you actually received this money, or when you actually had the will read out. When that happened, you were the beneficiary.
I'm sorry, you cut out.
Did I cut out?
I'm repeating that, yes.
Ms. Mars, you said after the will was read out, you had no idea that you were the beneficiary.
That's what I said on August 20th, yes.
But Miss Mars, that was a lie, wasn't it?
At the time it was. I'm sorry.
Was there an objection?
Yeah, I objected to hearsay as to the comments of Miss Mars at the day of her will, on the day of the will reading. Specifically, I can't believe that this happened.
These are the statements of Miss Mars on the day of the will reading.
That's correct, yes.
And you're objecting to hearsay.
That's right.
Response, Your Honor. Your Honor, we are most certainly not offering these statements to the truth. For the truth, it's in fact not our contention at all that Miss Mars did not know she was the beneficiary. We're instead offering these statements to show a contradiction in what Miss Mars is saying today, that at one point she knew that she was inheriting this money, said it would change her life. And at a later point, she said she had no idea she was inheriting this money. So we're not offering that for the truth at all, but rather for an impeachment of Miss Mars.
And even before that, is there a reason why this isn't party opponent?
Sorry, you cut out. Sorry, my internet's
Sorry.
not that great. Say it again.
Plaintiff's counsel, even before getting that you're not offering for the truth value, isn't this party opponent?
This is our party opponent, yes, Your Honor.
Yeah, overruled.
That's correct. That's correct. I actually submit to your ruling, Your Honor.
So again, Miss Mars, when you said you had no idea you were getting that money, you were lying, weren't you?
At the time I was.
And in fact, you were specifically lying because you wanted to avoid suspicion. Isn't that right?
Well, I didn't want to be involved in an investigation I wasn't part of.
Well, you were actually specifically worried that they would think you killed Miss Lee. Isn't that right?
Yeah, the same thing Stevie had been shouting for the last 24 hours.
Miss Mars, I just want to move on a little bit to Miss Lee's health. She took daily medications, isn't that right?
That's correct.
And every day you were the one who gave her those medications.
No, I would fill up her pill box every week and then she would take them every night.
But you were the only one who filled up that pill box, Miss Mars?
Yes, once I took over the position as head caretaker, I was the one who filled up the pill box.
And you'd actually agree with me that she would take any medication you gave her.
I mean, she would take the medication I put in the box.
Miss Mars, she would take anything you gave her?
I mean, I didn't assign medicine to her. All her medicine was prescribed by her doctors. I simply filled up the box with that.
One of those pills she was prescribed was a medication called Winterin.
That's right. In 2015, she was diagnosed with arthritis. After that, the doctor prescribed 2 Winterin pills that she would take every night.
And Miss Mars, you know that Winterin looks exactly like another medication called chloroandramine.
Yes. Since Miss Lee has a deadly allergy to chloroandramine, it was made very clear to me that it could never be allowed in the house.
Now, I want to move on to the day of August 14th. Now, at this time, permission for my co-counsel to display a demonstrative.
Please.
I just saw the comment about all loss, so I'll try and keep this short. Now, Miss Mars, I want to start with something that happened at the beginning of the day on August 14th. You overheard a conversation, you said, between Stevie and Miss Lee. Is that right?
That's right. Over breakfast in Agatha's study.
Now, Miss Mars, you were here earlier today for the testimony of Stevie Rogers?
I was.
And you heard Stevie say that in that conversation, Agatha Lee promised to change her will to make Stevie the beneficiary. You remember hearing that?
I mean, that's what Stevie said, but that wasn't what I heard on August 14th.
But that's what you heard Stevie here say today.
Yes, that's the only time I've heard him say that.
Now, Miss,
I'm sorry, you cut out again. I can't hear you.
Pardon. After you heard Stevie and Agatha discussing the will, you dropped Agatha off at a lunch appointment.
That's correct. She had an appointment at 12:30.
And on the way to that appointment, you heard Agatha call her lawyer.
I don't know who she called.
Is it your testimony that you don't know who she called that day?
I know she called a Kirby. I assumed it was Kirby Doolittle, but I don't actually know who she called.
So to be clear, you know she called her lawyer Kirby Doolittle.
No, I know she called a Kirby.
All right, Ms. Mars. So after you heard her call a Kirby, you dropped her off at her lunch appointment and you went to the store.
That's correct. I wanted to pick up a few things.
Now, when you were at the store, you bought some medication, some toiletries.
I don't think I bought any medication, no. I did pick up a few toiletries, though.
But you actually didn't get a receipt when you were there at the pharmacy, did you?
No, I never request receipts from the drugstore. They're just kind of a waste of paper.
And you paid exclusively in cash?
Yeah, I only picked up one thing, so I just paid with a $10 bill.
And after you paid in cash and didn't get a receipt, you went back home with Agatha, isn't that right?
Well, I mean, I waited until 1:30, and then I picked her up from her lunch date and took her back home.
Now I want to talk about what happened later that night. Ms. Mars, again, you were here for the testimony of Stevie Rogers?
Yes, I was.
And you heard Stevie say that he saw you sneaking into Agatha's room at 9:30.
That's correct.
And Ms. Mars, you're aware that that night Agatha Lee was given a chloroandramine pill soon after 9 p.m.
I don't think I actually know when she took the pill. I was told later, after the autopsy had been conducted with a toxicology report, that they found that in her system, but I have no idea when she took it.
Ms. Mars, do you need me to refresh your memory from the toxicology report that you've reviewed?
Your Honor, objection to misleading the jury as to the demonstrative specifically at 9:35 p.m. saying Rogers sees Mars enter Agatha's room.
What's the objection to?
Your Honor, it states that Rogers sees Mars enter Agatha's room from Rogers' perspective. Yet Drew Mars hasn't testified to whether or not this was the case for herself, whether she was actually walking towards Agatha's room or seen entering Agatha's room. And the fact that this timeline was the 9:35 p.m. specifically was displayed during the testimony or the testimony given by Drew Mars currently, it's misleading the jury to say that Drew Mars actually agreed with this timestamp, that this happened.
Response, Your Honor?
No, for the purposes of today's trial, I'll overrule the objection, but we'll note it in the records and maybe I'll get reversed on appeal. You can continue.
Yes, Your Honor. Ms. Mars, you'd agree with me that Ms. Lee ingested a chloroandramine pill between 9 p.m. and 3 a.m. Isn't that right?
And that's what I was told.
Thank you, Ms. Mars. I have no further questions.
Any redirect?
No, for the purposes of time, Your Honor, no redirect. We'd like this witness to step down.
Great. Thanks, Ms. Mars. Defense, next witness.
At this time, Your Honor, the defense would like to call Mr. Ryan Cabrera to the stand.
Sounds good.
All right. And before I begin, Mr. Cabrera, I just want to let you know my internet is not doing too well today. So if I ever cut you off, just let me know and I'll let you finish your answer.
Of course.
All right, may I proceed, Your Honor? Good afternoon, Mr. Cabrera. Could you please introduce yourself to the members of the jury?
Of course. Good afternoon. My name is Ryan Cabrera. How are you?
Doing well. How are you, sir?
Man, I tell you what, 5 months in quarantine is really getting to me. and never thought I'd be delivering any statement in front of a court, especially on Zoom. So you could say 2020 is a little different.
Well, I'm sorry to hear about that. How's work holding up, sir?
It's been good. I've been letting the creative juices flow a little bit. I've been actually experimenting on a fiction piece. It's about a guy a bit down on his luck that works for the water company. We're calling it "I Don't Give a Damn."
Well, sir, what exactly is your line of work?
When people are more willing to meet in person and interview, I'm a biographer. I've actually made quite a career out of it.
Well, anything we'd know?
Possibly. I mean, I've written pieces on athletes, politicians. Those are some interesting characters. Cooks, even authors. I write about the writers.
Well, did you ever write something about Miss Lee?
Yeah, actually. I was working on a biography when she passed away. She'd been an idol of mine since I actually used to work on my dissertation at Yale. It was, on the evolution of crime novels throughout the 20th century.
Well, did you ever meet with Ms. Lee while working on that biography?
Oh, yeah, a whole bunch. Agatha and I met multiple times a week, every week for 6 months, like clockwork. It was kind of crazy becoming friends with someone you looked up to.
When was the first time that you met with Miss Lee?
It was February 8th, 2018. It's about 3 years after I first reached out to her, but meeting with her was the highlight of my week.
Well, what did the two of you talk about?
You name it, we talked about it. We talked about her childhood, her grandson, Stevie, of course, her career, politics, just about anything.
Did she ever tell you about someone named Drew Mars?
Yeah. Drew was Agatha's caretaker. She spoke about every time we met.
Did you personally ever meet Drew?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I'd see her every time I went to Lee Manor, and sometimes she would drop Agatha off when we meet for lunch.
Well, how often would you see the two of them together?
Man, all the time. Drew and Agatha, they were attached at the hip. I know Drew is a caretaker, but they acted more like family.
Well, how so?
I mean, you couldn't not notice it. The way they talked to one another, the way they hugged, the way they looked at one another, they were close.
Now, you mentioned earlier that Ms. Lee often talked about her grandchild, Stevie.
Mm-hmm.
What did she say about him?
I mean, she told me that, he'd left home and really disappeared from her life. It had been years since they'd spoken. Her eyes, they'd always well up whenever she'd talk about him. I was actually thinking about writing a chapter about it.
Well, I'd like to move on to the last time you spoke with Miss Lee.
Sure.
When was that?
That was August 14th. It was unfortunately the day before she died.
Well, how was Miss Lee acting that day?
Agatha was a lot less energetic, definitely less talkative than usual. It felt like she had a cloud over her the whole time.
Did you ask her what was wrong?
Yeah, I did. She started talking about Stevie.
What did she say about Stevie?
She told me that Stevie had asked her for something, but that she had
Objection, hearsay.
Your Honor, may I be heard? Now, prior to today's trial, both parties agreed that this witness, Ms. Lee, or my apologies, Ms. Lee isn't a witness here today, but that Ms. Lee was unavailable as a witness within the meaning of 804. Now, one of the exceptions under which 804 can apply is when that unavailable person was talking about events related to their personal or family history. Members of the jury, that's exactly what she's doing here. She's talking about her life events, specifically about what happened between her and her son. This should be admitted under that rule.
What is the statement specifically?
I'm not sure exactly how much the witness was able to say, but I believe the statement was along the lines of, Agatha Lee told me that Stevie had asked her for something, but that she felt she had to say no.
May I respond?
Please.
Under the definitions of 804B, that's not, opposing counsel is arguing that this falls under an exception that talks about family history. And now opposing counsel is tailoring that rule way too broadly. The family history is specific to genealogy or lineage or how people are related, not just recounting any memory that they might have had. This statement that Stevie asked me for something, that's inadmissible hearsay.
Yeah, I think the plaintiff counsel is right on the reading of this rule at this point. Do you have another response to the hearsay objection?
Well, actually, Your Honor, I would like to point out that in regards to 804.4a, it does point out that other similar facts might also apply. And this sort of fact would apply. But in addition to that, we also believe this would fall under another exception, 803 subsection 3, which allows for statements of memory or belief, so long as they relate to the validity of the declarant's will. And in this case, that's exactly what we're talking about. It's our contention that Ms. Lee was talking about the contents of her will. And at that time, and that's the most logical explanation of what was being asked of her and what she was saying no about. That means this would fall under 803 subsection 3 as a hearsay exception.
May I respond?
Please.
I have it on a good faith basis that this witness did not hear the word will come up in this entire conversation, that opposing counsel will be unable to connect this conversation that Mr. Cabrera had with Agatha Lee to be about the conversation opposing counsel is referring to about the will changing.
So I know that he can't connect it. He might not be able to connect it on the record. Is there any sort of, I know I'm allowed to consider inadmissible evidence when ruling on things like hearsay. Is there any inadmissible or other evidence out there that this is about a will, in fact?
Yes, Your Honor, the timing. My apologies, were you finished, Your Honor?
No, nope, that's it. Just the timing, though?
Yes, Your Honor, the timing. The fact that this meeting happened on the same day after in which Ms. Lee had that conversation with Stevie Rogers, in which Stevie Rogers asked her to be put in that will, and she said no. Well, that's strong circumstantial evidence that she was talking about the will in this case.
Response, Your Honor?
No, on those grounds, I think I'm going to sustain the objection.
And move to strike.
Just that statement, right.
So, Mr. Cabrera, did you try to make her feel better?
Yeah, I did. I tried to tell her.
Objection, relevance.
Okay.
Sorry, overruled.
What were you saying, Mr. Cabrera?
I can repeat it. That's all right. I tried to tell her everything was going to be okay, but all she said was, I hope he forgives me.
Objection, hearsay.
Once.
May I be heard, Your Honor?
Yes, please.
Well, this particular statement, which I believe was that Ms. Lee was saying that she hoped that Stevie would forgive her. Well, that actually falls under 8033 as well, though a different part of 8033. 8033 applies to statements concerning an emotional condition, and that's exactly what this is. She's describing a hope of hers. So this should fall under that rule.
I'll overrule the objection. Overruled, you can continue.
Could you finish up what you were saying, Mr. Cabrera?
As I said, she said that she hoped she'd be forgiven for her decision.
Well, did you ever ask Ms. Lee what she hoped that Stevie would forgive her for?
I did, but she didn't go into any details with me. All she said is that it was personal.
Well, there's one last thing I'd like to ask you about. When did you learn that Miss Lee had passed away?
It was the next morning, August 15th.
Who told you?
It was Drew. Drew called me.
Well, how did she sound?
She was sobbing on the other end. I could barely understand a word she was saying, but I knew it wasn't good.
Thank you. At this time, we've got no further questions.
Thank you, counsel. Cross-examination. Ms. Song, you're still on mute.
That would be tough to ask some questions on mute.
Good afternoon, Mr. Cabrera.
Hey, good afternoon. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm here.
Now, I want to start by talking about something you mentioned on direct examination about the relationship between the defendant and Miss Lee.
Sure, what you want to talk about?
Well, I want to talk about how you mentioned they seem to be really close.
Drew Mars and Agatha?
That's right.
No, they seem close.
You would even say that they have a special bond.
Yeah, I mean, you had a better relationship with Agatha than I have with my grandmother.
Well, it seemed to you like Miss Lee had trusted the defendant implicitly.
I mean, you could say there was trust between them, yeah.
You would call that trust implicit.
What's that?
You would call that trust implicit.
Implicit, you could see it, yes. It was tangible.
And you've seen the defendant bring Agatha Lee her pills before, right?
Couple times. When I was at Lee Manor, I saw it. Yeah.
Well, when you saw the defendant bring Miss Lee her pills, you saw Miss Lee take them without hesitation.
Yeah, she would take the pills, yes.
Without question.
She never asked a question when I was there.
Without even asking what those pills were.
No, it looked like a daily dose of something that she was used to taking.
Well, you even heard Agatha Lee say, "You know, I will take anything you hand me."
Yeah, she was laughing when she said that.
She said, "You know, I'll take anything you hand me," to the defendant.
Yes, ma'am. As I said, she was laughing while she was saying it.
Now, Mr. Cabrera, I want to talk a little bit about why you are here today.
All right, go ahead.
Now, you're here testifying because the defendant offered you anything Miss Lee owned in exchange for your testimony.
No, not exactly.
We can break that down, Mr. Cabrera. 2 months ago, the defendant calls you up on the phone.
Yeah, Drew gave me a call.
And on that call, she asked you to testify.
She asked me if I would be open to answering some questions here.
That's testifying, right?
I would assume so, yes.
You know that's right.
Yes.
And she also asked you on that same phone call if there's anything of Agatha's that you might like.
Yeah, she said that it looked like me and Agatha were close, and if I was interested in anything to let her know.
Well, you were interested in Agatha's private book collection.
I was. I write books for a living, and I've always loved literature. I would have loved to have had them.
Exactly, Mr. Cabrera, you were a writer, so you know that those books, they're worth millions of dollars.
There's a possibility they could have substantial value. Yes, I also work with literary museums.
Well, Agatha Lee specifically, she's a best-selling author.
Yes, ma'am. That's why I was writing her biography.
But she's only ever written one novel.
She's only published one novel.
That's right. So we're talking here about these unpublished books that could be worth millions of dollars.
Theoretically, they could be worth anything.
And the defendant said if by the time this trial's over and they're inheriting Agatha's estate, they'd give you those unpublished works.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Cabrera. I have no further questions.
Any redirect?
No redirect, Your Honor. We ask that this witness be allowed to step down. With that, the defense closes its case in chief, and we'd be happy to move straight into closing arguments. Given
right, thank you,
however, we
Mr.
have
Cabrera.
17 minutes left, would opposing counsel like to split closing arguments so that each of us has around 7, 8 minutes.
Yes, and if someone could actually give a visual signal if I'm cutting up on 8 minutes, say, that would be really appreciated so that I know to stop.
Yeah, just so everyone knows, we went back to the tab room and got an extra few minutes, so we have 22 minutes remaining before all loss.
Sweet.
Perfect. I guess we can both take 10 minutes then.
All right, so we'll go straight into closings then. Everyone, please switch back into speaker view if you aren't already. And plaintiff, you can get started whenever you're ready.
Your Honor, opposing counsel, members of the jury, and may it please the court. You know I'll take anything you hand me. The person who said that is now dead. Because the person Agatha Lee said that to was the defendant, Drew Mars, who on August 14th, 2018, decided to switch the pills to secure the money. At the beginning of today's trial, my co-counsel, Ms. Rayfield, introduced you to the family that today's trial is all about. That was a grandson trying to reconnect with his grandmother. We heard today about how Stevie Rogers decides to move back in with his grandmother and try to patch up their relationship after family tragedy had set them apart for many, many years. And as they live together day by day, their relationship just grows closer and closer. So much so that we heard that Miss Lee was actually planning to change her will to leave Stevie everything she owned. But there was just one problem, one person getting in the way of this storybook ending. And that was the defendant, Drew Mars. Because we heard about this conversation where Agatha Lee said she would change her will on the morning of August 14th. Well, that conversation came up over and over again today. And there was actually some conflicting testimony about what was actually said, whether or not Stevie Rogers got what he asked for, that Stevie Rogers would be the beneficiary of the latest will. But the thing is, members of the jury, before any change in that will happened, Agatha Lee dies. And that happens on the night of August 14th, the same day this conversation happens, because we know Drew Mars overheard that conversation and decided she had to act to secure her money. Now, members of the jury, before we get any further, I do want to remind you that today's case is not a criminal proceeding. But we heard a lot today about whether or not someone might have killed Agatha Lee because the law requires, or rather prohibits, a killer from inheriting their victim's money. Both counsels talked about it in opening statements. That's called the Slayer statute. And so what you're here to decide, members of the jury, is whether it's more likely than not that Drew Mars purposefully or knowingly caused Agatha Lee's death. And as the plaintiff in today's case, we have the burden of proof to prove to you by a preponderance of the evidence, simply meaning that more likely than not, Drew Mars killed Agatha Lee. And we've proven that to you. We've met our burden by showing you the means, the motive, and the opportunity the defendant had to switch those pills and secure the money. So let's start with the easy one, and that's opportunity. Because no party in today's case is disputing the fact that there were just 3 people in the house on August 14th. That was Agatha Lee, Stevie Rogers, and Drew Mars. So in terms of an opportunity, we also heard from Stevie Rogers today. They saw the defendant sneaking into Agatha Lee's room around 9:30 that night. And that, members of the jury, is the moment that switch happens, the opportunity the defendant had to switch those pills. Now let's talk a bit about motive. Because opposing counsel has been claiming today that there's no reason Drew Mars would have killed Agatha Lee. Members of the jury, we know that Drew Mars was the beneficiary of the active will when Agatha Lee died, meaning that Drew Mars had 20 million reasons to kill Agatha Lee. When my co-counsel cross-examined Drew Mars, she admitted that at the time, she had a sick sister and that she thought it would be too late to get enough money to help out that sick sister. Members of the jury, that's the reason, the motive, the why of why the defendant would kill Agatha Lee, to secure her money. And she knew she had to act fast, because after overhearing that conversation the morning of August 14th, she knew that if she didn't act soon, Agatha Lee would meet with her lawyer and change the will. Now let's move on to means. We heard about the drug today that killed Agatha Lee called chloroandramine. And those came in pills that looked identical to the pills that Agatha Lee regularly took, the arthritis pills. And so we know that it was a switch of those pills that caused her to die. And opposing counsel seems to be claiming today that Stevie Rogers had something to do with that, as if Stevie Rogers got access to that room. But members of the jury, remember that Drew Mars was the caretaker. They had 10 years of experience handing pills to Agatha Lee. In fact, Drew Mars was the one who restocked that pillbox. We heard that quote, "You know, I'll take anything you hand me." There was that level of implicit trust, as Mr. Cabrera observed, of the two of them, between the caretaker and Agatha Lee. We also know that the defendant visited a pharmacy on August 14th. After dropping Agatha off at lunch, that's when she went to buy these pills. And members of the jury, those are the means. But I do want to talk a little bit about what opposing counsel has been saying about Stevie Rogers, how he needed money, how money could have been Stevie Rogers' motive. But members of the jury, that's not true. They're painting a false equivalence between Stevie Rogers and Drew Mars. Because opposing counsel asked Stevie Rogers a lot about how those trips to the Caribbean were. That's what they're alleging Stevie Rogers stood to lose. That's what they're alleging Stevie Rogers needed money for, vacations, a certain lifestyle. That's not the same thing as the defendant having a sick sibling at the time, desperate to get her hands on some money to help out her family. And in fact, this is a really extreme claim to point the finger at Stevie Rogers, because they really presented no supporting evidence whatsoever. And Stevie Rogers, well, he didn't need the money immediately. There was no urgency to him trying to get more money. In fact, Stevie Rogers could have stuck around just a bit longer to win back his grandmother's affection, to really cement his place to be written back into her will. Stevie Rogers could have done a number of things, get a job, get a loan. He could have done really so many things for money rather than jumping to kill the grandmother he was reconnecting with. And so for this claim that Stevie Rogers did, I want to remind you, members of the jury, where that bag of pills was found: the defendant's closet. The only person's fingerprints found on that bag, the defendant's. The only person we know handles Agatha Lee's pills, that would be the defendant. "You know, I'll take anything you hand me." Who did Miss Lee say that to? The defendant. And you have to admit, this was some really convenient timing for Drew Mars, who overhears the conversation of her being written out of the will in the morning, and then Agatha Lee is dead by evening. That's no coincidence. And so, members of the jury, don't let Drew Mars get away with this. We ask that you find in favor of the plaintiff. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. Defense? Do we have the defense closer?
Yes, Your Honor. Although I believe the host of this meeting turned my video off, unfortunately, so I cannot turn it on right now.
Ooh, sorry.
All good.
I tried to turn.
Perfect. Thank you, sir.
Go ahead and get started. Thank you.
May I proceed, Your Honor?
Go ahead.
Miss Mars had no reason to murder Miss Lee. Now, you heard a lot today about a conversation behind closed doors. Stevie Rogers said that in that conversation, Miss Lee said that she would give him everything, put him back in the will. And members of the jury, the reason that you heard a lot about that conversation behind closed doors is because it's very important to the prosecution's case. Without that conversation, Ms. Lee had no motive to commit this crime. Well, Ms. Mars was already in that will. If the will wasn't going to change, she didn't need to commit any crime. But members of the jury, that conversation behind closed doors, which their case relies upon, there's a problem with it. Never happened. In fact, members of the jury, it doesn't even make sense. What we heard was in that meeting, Miss Lee said that nothing would go to Stevie Rogers. And that's a problem for their case, members of the jury, because it meant that Miss Lee had no reason, or Ms. Mars had no reason to murder Miss Lee. Let's talk about the law for a little bit, because the plaintiff had the burden of proof in this case. So they had to prove to you, by preponderance of the evidence, that my client, Drew Mars, murdered Ms. Lee. Break that down for you, it just means they had to show you it's more likely than not. But they can't do that, members of the jury, because their case, their story, lacks one thing, and that's a reason for Miss Lee, for Miss Mars to have committed this crime. So I want to walk you through the three of the problems with their case. Three problems which all relate to that central theme, that Ms. Mars had no reason to kill Ms. Lee. The first problem is that conversation behind closed doors didn't happen the way they said it did. Second problem, while Ms. Lee did not have a motive to commit this crime, Stevie Rogers did. And third, Miss Lee and Miss Mars, they were like family. Let's walk through each of those 3 points one by one. Start with that conversation behind closed doors. So I want you to ask yourself, whose story is right? Drew Mars told you that she overheard that conversation, and in it, Ms. Lee said that Stevie Rogers was not getting a penny now or ever. Or Stevie Rogers told you something completely different. But when you're trying to find out who told the right story, there are two questions you should ask yourself. One, well, what story is corroborated? And two, which one makes sense? Let's start with that first question. Which story is corroborated? And it's Drew Mars. We heard from Ryan Cabrera, who took that stand, looked in the eyes, and he told you that later that day, he spoke with Miss Lee. Miss Lee was telling him about how she felt so sad that she hoped Stevie would forgive her for something. Keep in mind, this was just a couple hours after that conversation behind closed doors took place. Members of the jury, do you want to Members of the jury, I want you to ask yourselves that Ms. Lee would be saying, oh, I hope that Stevie Rogers will forgive me for leaving him $25 million. Of course not. That doesn't make any sense. Ryan Cabrera's evidence corroborates that in that meeting, Ms. Lee said Stevie Rogers wouldn't get a penny. I want you to ask yourselves, which of those two stories makes sense? And it's definitely Drew Mars. Do you really think that after all we've heard about Ms. Lee, her generosity, how much she cared about Ms. Mars, that she would just completely take Ms. Mars out of her will? Does that sound like something she would do? No. They have, the plaintiff has this story for you. They want you to believe that, well, Mr. Rogers, he made his grandmother mad by not visiting her often enough. But once he went to go meet her again, she felt better and she decided to put him back in their will. Members of the jury, Ms. Lee didn't take Mr. Rogers out of her will because she was mad at him. She took him out of her will because she loved him. And she wanted him to learn to stand on his own 2 feet. And that was not something that was going to change on August 14th or on any other day. Everything that we know about Ms. Lee supports Drew Mars' story. Drew Mars had no reason to commit this crime because she was in that will and she was staying in that will. Well, that brings us to the second problem with their case. While Drew Mars didn't have a reason to commit this crime, well, Stevie Rogers did. And to understand that, you have to know about a piece of law called the Slayer Statute. Well, the Slayer Statute says it's pretty simple. If you kill someone, you can't get their money. And we heard from the plaintiff. He was in law school. It makes sense. He might have known about this law, or at least how to find out about it. And if Drew Mars couldn't inherit that money, it would have gone to him as next of kin. So he had a reason, and more than that, he had nothing to lose. He wasn't about to get that money anytime soon, and it was $20 million. So he had a motive. And on top of that, we heard from the plaintiff's hired gun, Mr. Bond. Even he admitted that it was possible for Mr. Rogers to have put those pills, to have had access to Miss Lee's pill organizer. But he didn't know who put that bag in that closet. You might be wondering, well, how did the defendant's fingerprints get on that bag then? Well, the answer is simple. It was in her closet. She probably bumped into it while she was digging through her closet. In fact, I want you to ask yourselves, why was the murder weapon lying in her closet for over a week? There's one logical explanation. Because she didn't know it was there. And that brings us to the third problem of their case. That Miss Mars and Miss Lee, they were like family. In fact, you even heard it from the plaintiff's own opening statement. It was obvious. They were close. Members of the jury, you heard from all sorts of different witnesses about how much time they'd spent together, how much they cared about each other, about how much Ms. Lee cared for Ms. Mars. Ms. Mars would never have done a thing to hurt Ms. Lee as she treated her like family. Members of the jury, you're back in that deliberation room. If you're ever unsure about where to look, what to think of all this complex evidence, I want you to do one thing. It's something that Mr. Olmasekian mentioned at the start of today's trial. Look back to that conversation behind closed doors. Because only one person walked away from that conversation with a motive to commit murder. And it was not my client. Drew Mars had no reason to kill Ms. Lee. Find her not guilty. Thank you.
All right, plaintiff, you have 60 seconds for rebuttal.
May I proceed?
Go ahead.
Now, opposing counsel talked a lot about that Slayer statute, that Stevie Rogers would have a reason because of that law. But here's the thing. Stevie wouldn't have gotten the money if Grandma had died because he wasn't the beneficiary of the will. No, that was Drew Mars. So it would have taken hoops, bureaucratic hoops, for Stevie Rogers to have to jump through years upon years. I mean, this trial is happening 2 years after Agatha Lee died. Stevie Rogers wouldn't have just gotten the money out of a simple transaction. This was really risky. If he were trying to frame Drew Mars, this would be an elaborate scheme to have an investigation happen, wait months and months for that money to maybe fall into his hands. Members of the jury, that just doesn't make sense. If Stevie Rogers really needed money, he could have gotten a job at the local Dairy Queen. Whereas for Drew Mars, she needed that money immediately, because she overhears that conversation in the morning about how she's losing out on that will. And Agatha Lee is dead by evening. Stop the defendant from profiting off of Agatha Lee's death. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. All right, this case is now submitted. Judges, please complete and submit your ballots. I'll ask everyone to stay on until those ballots are submitted, and then we'll do some brief comments. And Glenn, are you going to move folks into breakout rooms?
Correct.